All right. Good morning. It's so good to see those of you here, those of you on Zoom. I've been kind of watching on my laptop, and it's so good to see all of you coming in on this beautiful April day. I don't know if you saw what I saw, but there is a 100% chance of snow on Tuesday. Such is life. We're going to roll with it. If you're out in Facebook land or watching on our live stream and I haven't met you yet, my name is Jimmy, and I'm the director of church life here at Second. And it's such a privilege to be able to work with you, to connect with you, to work with our deacons, and to occasionally get to share the little bits of wisdom that I've been able to hopefully amass in my years of life. And I was actually really excited to share as part of this series. And Kristen set us up last week with this discussion of continuing the discussion about resurrection. We talked about on Easter the story that we all know and love, and how packed it is with sorrow and hope and all of the emotions that are in between. But we're continuing that discussion and exploring this idea of what it means to be reborn, what it means to be resurrected, to give new life and to have a new chance for something different. And I've been wanting to explore that. There's a principle that I want to try to unpack with you all this morning. To start off, though, I want to have you think, wherever you are, about a moving day. Think about the day that you packed up all your belongings and you moved from one place you were living to another place you were living. Maybe it was when you left home for the first time, or when you moved into a home that had more rooms as your family was expanding. Maybe it was to move to a new place for a new job. But there's a lot of emotions that tend to happen in that process, right? There's this sense of nostalgia and memories of what's happened. There's an excitement and an anticipation. And then there's probably some dread about the process of going through all the things that have found a home to pick them up, and then they have to find somewhere new to live in your new space and all of that. But I want to ask you, and I want to get a little technical here, about the timeline of what that moving process looks like. And so there's a few points on this way, and there's a lot of things in between, but kind of a few major points. And I want to ask you the question, when did the new thing start? So you start off living in one location, living in home A. At some point, you decide to pack up all of your belongings in home A, and you stick them all in cardboard boxes, and you tape all those cardboard boxes up, and you hopefully label them correctly for their new location in your new space. And then you leave, and then you show up at the new place, and you begin to unpack. Hope all the boxes end up in close to the right space of where they need to go. And you begin to try to imagine what's going to be convenient and efficient for you as you kind of settle into this new life. And then at some point, and you usually don't recognize this point, this isn't an event, but you wake up one day and the new place kind of feels like home. So these are kind of the major turning points. So I want to ask you, when did the new thing begin? Look at this timeline, and you don't have to pick one of the specific points because there are more. Maybe you could argue that the very end, the very last point, when it feels like home, the new thing has started. Maybe that's your argument. Or maybe we back it up a little bit. The day you step foot in that new place, the new thing has started. The old is gone, the new has come, and here you are. You're going to get it all set up, and maybe that's the starting point. Or maybe you back up and you say, you know what? As soon as my normal life got disrupted, packed everything up, as soon as things came off the walls and I couldn't find things anymore, that's the beginning of the end. Or maybe it was kind of just before that when you signed a contract or a lease or a mortgage and you officially owned or had permission to live in the new space. Maybe that's when it all started. But I actually want to, as I think about this whole process philosophically, I think it's even before that. Because I think the beginning begins the second you decide that something needs to change. the first time it occurs to you, the first conclusion you come to that it is time I need something different, that is when the new thing begins. I had a mentor one time. He's a wonderful man in my life, and a lot of the wisdom that I live with and the principles that I live with, I can point back to these beautiful conversations with him. And this was the proverb that he always used to say to us. He said, "Beginnings never begin with a beginning. Beginnings always begin with an ending." I want to go back to our Easter story for a second. And not just the Easter story, but a little bit before that, and look at the Gospel of John. And I want to, as I was preparing this, I began to ask the question, what did Jesus do when he knew that the end was coming? Now, we have a lot of evidence in Scripture to point to the fact that Jesus knew that there was some new beginning that was going to happen. Death was not the end. We see this, he talks about destroying the temple and rebuilding it in 3 days. All of this happens very early on in Jesus's ministry. He had some knowledge or some belief that something was going to happen after what appeared to be the end. But 7 days before his resurrection, he comes into Jerusalem. And that's where I want to pick up our story in John chapter 12. Now I'm going to jump around a little bit, a couple verses from John chapter 12, and then I want to kind of highlight a few things that are happening in that week. And the reason, I'll tell you why I'm starting here in just a second, but let's start at John chapter 12, starting at verse 23. Jesus replied. Some people had come to ask to speak to Jesus, and the disciples had said, Jesus is busy. And so Jesus replies, "The time has come for the human one to be glorified. I assure you that unless a grain of wheat falls to the earth and dies, it can only be a single seed. But if it dies, it bears much fruit." We jump ahead to John chapter 13, starting at verse 1. Before the festival of Passover, Jesus knew that his time had come to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them fully. And Jesus and his disciples were sharing an evening meal. Verse 5 says, "Then he poured water into a wash basin and began to wash the disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that he was wearing." After they have a discussion about a variety of other topics, verse 14 says, Jesus says, "If I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you too must wash each other's feet. I have given you an example. Just as I have done, you also must do." Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So I picked this passage in particular, and the gospel writer reiterates it in chapter 12 and in chapter 13. It says, Jesus knew that his time had come. Jesus knew that his time was drawing near. And if we go back to our moving principle here, if beginnings begin with an ending, then this was the beginning of the process for Jesus. And so Jesus used his time intentionally because he knew that a new thing was coming. And I want you to think about, especially in that chapter 13, look at the example that Jesus sets for how to spend his time bringing that season to a close. The example of service and love and communion and time with others and celebrating and remembering the times that they had. Many of you know that my husband Aaron and I have a almost 7-month-old. I cannot wait for you all to meet her. Her name is Sierra. And we're at the final stages of the adoption process. And one of the things that we are hoping to teach Sierra, she's a little too young to really understand this concept, but one of the things that we want to teach her, and I can hear all of you parents kind of chuckling at my naivete, is to teach her what to do when she is finished playing with something. Because there inevitably, I can see the writing on the wall, there will inevitably be a point where we are playing with something, a toy, a puzzle, blocks, and it is likely she will want to play with something else. And at that moment, we are going to begin the beginning of the new thing by beginning with an ending. And hopefully the lesson that we will teach her is before you can play with the new thing, you have to clean up the old thing. And that hopefully is a principle that we will instill in her. And I see all the smiles on your face, those of you that are in the sanctuary right now. We'll get there eventually, I hope. But that right from an early age, we actually are already having these conversations about what it means to be responsible, what it means to grow up, to be mature, that it's healthy for us to learn this lesson, even when playing with toys, that let's find a way to end what we're doing well so that we can begin the new thing. Because it is not the story that you want where you look around and nothing has ended well. And you just begin this process of not learning how to end things well. What do you end up with? A mess. So part of this passage that I read out of John chapter 12 is talking about seeds. And I actually kind of did a little bit of a deep dive into the biology of this process and began to see that this idea of seeds dying before they can grow is not technically accurate. But we also don't read this as a science textbook. We read it as metaphor and for a teachability moment. And whether it's dead or whether it's dormant, the principle of what Jesus is trying to convey is deeply profound. Because people have done studies, you can burn or boil a seed, and it actually does kill it to where it cannot grow anymore. But the natural process of a plant or a tree growing is for a fruit to produce a seed, and for that seed to go on a journey to somewhere else, and for that seed to wait until the environment is right for the life within it to begin to emerge. It needs soil, it needs light, it needs water, and the seed actually can wait quite a long time before it needs to begin. It waits. The reason that we might say that it looks dead is that the husk around it does look like it has died. That protective covering is there. And that protective covering is the thing from its past. It's the thing from the tree. The parent plant provides that protection as it journeys, and then that husk, once the environment is right, actually provides the first source of nutrients to the new budding plant. The new budding plant, you could even say from an evolutionary perspective, carries with it more information than its parent plant had. Maybe a resistance to some kind of disease, it may be a more familiar environment, maybe it's more adaptive to an environment that might be foreign to it. But the past, the thing that it came from, is what supplies it with that first little burst of life for it to actually take seed, take root, and begin to grow and begin the process all over again. And the point I think that Jesus is trying to make is how beautiful that process is, but he's also talking about expansion. He's talking about a seed must fall into the earth so that it might produce more fruit, and not more seeds, more fruit, because fruits tend to carry a lot of seeds that can expand and grow. It's part of the process of even going all the way back to Genesis. Be fruitful and multiply. Begin to share that, whether in a physical sense or in a relational sense. Share the love, pass it on, expand it, let your reach kind of begin to go beyond yourself. Such a beautiful metaphor here. But the seed first has to do what? It has to leave where it came from. It has to go on a journey. It has to wait. It has to find the right environment. And when it does, it takes it a little bit for it to begin. That spark of life is within it this whole time, the DNA. And as soon as the environment is right, the past begins to nourish it. And it begins to start something new in and of itself, which then will eventually produce fruit, which will then eventually produce seeds, who will eventually go on a journey on their own. And that's how we get this idea of legacy, the idea of passing things on. One of my favorite books series growing up was C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. And I read that book. My mom actually took it away from me at one point because I was so ferocious in reading these 7 books over and over again. I loved the whimsy and the magic and the imagination that went with these stories. But the very first book in the series is called The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Many of you have probably either heard of it or read it. These 4 British children escaping the war get sucked into this fantasy world where there is a winter. And right off the bat, they meet this stern-looking, all-white dressed woman. And the more that they go into the story, the more they learn that the world they've walked into, the Narnia that they have walked into, is under a curse to where it is always winter and never Christmas. And as a child, I think we're supposed to really get this sense of, oh, there's no Christmas? But as an adult, we began to look at it. I looked at it again, reflected back on it, and I said the curse was that the season was not allowed to continue. The new thing was forbidden to come. Christmas was a mile marker, but that actually wasn't when the children begin to notice that the curse is beginning to break. They begin to notice the snow melting, the grass beginning to bloom. The Father Christmas comes a little bit later in the story. But you think about what a curse that is if something is not allowed to move forward. It's not allowed to birth the new thing. It gets stuck in this kind of perpetual winter, this perpetual dormancy. And I have to wonder if in the last year with us being in quarantine and COVID, if we have kind of felt like it's been a perpetual winter. Change happens in one of 2 ways. One is intentional change, where you decide to make a change. And the other is unexpected or inevitable change, something you have to react to. It's kind of done against your will. And COVID is going to teach us both of those, because a year ago, it was unexpected and inevitable, and we had to figure out what we were going to do. We had to react to the reality of the world around us. And it changed, whether we liked it or not. The world changed around us. And there is a part of me that wonders if the grieving process, the ending well process, was something we were robbed of because of how quickly we had to transition, because of how quickly we had to all begin to back away and go into quarantine and going to get severed from some of our relationships, or at least our normal flow of life, things that brought us joy, things that made us feel like we were autonomous and free and had agency to do things. And it's hard when you don't have time, when you don't get the time to plan out and intentionally end well. And here we are a year. We've probably kind of swept up most of that and pulled ourselves together and found a way to meet some of the needs in our life. Thank God for being able to get on Zoom and to meet with our church family or with friends in virtual settings or safely distanced. But we found a way to make this new normal work. But now is the time that we get to think about the intentional change that is coming. There is a light at the end of the tunnel and the beginning of the end. I don't know when it was for you, but as soon as a vaccine began to be available, I don't know if something changed within you, but all of a sudden it was like, okay, like light at the end, you sit a little forward in your seat, pay attention a little bit more. Okay, here we go. Beginnings never start with a beginning. Beginnings always start with an ending, which means that right now, our new beginning has begun. Today, we have started the new process. Whatever return or whatever new normal is coming, that starts today, because we have the opportunity over the next several months, potentially over the next year. There are many other countries that are not at the same pace of immunizations. This is going to be a process. But today is the day that we get to think about what it's going to look like to end well. What does that look like? What does the budding of new spring look like? What did Jesus do when the end of a season was there? You don't have to have liked one season over the other. It's kind of human nature for us to pursue pleasure and minimize pain. And whether ending something is ending pain or ending something you really loved, a change is happening. So what are you going to do with it? What are you going to do with this time that we have right now? You can just wait it out because the world will change inevitably. But if you want to change intentionally and follow these examples, you might actually get something valuable out of this process. You might find that there's some joy that you have gotten to experience in our year in quarantine. Maybe it's made you really, really grateful for really small things, really simple things. Maybe going on a walk means something different now. Maybe looking around and watching spring burst around you means something really different this year than it ever has. Maybe relationships, conversations, maybe those mean something a little bit different. I know that even on Sunday mornings, we have people that don't live in Kansas City that join us every Sunday. They've become part of our little church family, and that was never available before. Something new started as part of this. What are we going to do with this time that we have right now? Because I believe there are some things that happen if we don't end well. First, I don't think we fully learn the lesson. I don't think we learn the lesson about what transition is supposed to teach us. We don't learn how to pick up our toys. That teaches us something. We develop a habit that may not serve us well. We might end up in regret of time lost. We might end up with a reputation that we don't want of not ending things well, or we might just leave a mess in our wake. We might start to fear endings instead of embracing the beauty in them because they're natural. Look at the world around us. An ending is currently happening. You could say a beginning has already begun. We don't fully get to celebrate the good things that happened in the past seasons if we don't learn how to take time to end well. And last, surprise endings are going to take a much harsher toll on us if we aren't used to dealing with change, if we haven't incorporated the life principle of learning how to end well. Surprise endings are going to take a toll. I'm going to leave you with this quote before we go into our breakout rooms. This is from Lao Tzu. Life is a series of natural and spontaneous changes. Don't resist them. That only creates sorrow. Let reality be reality. Let things flow naturally forward in whatever way they like. You can look at that through a lens of pessimism, or you can look at that through a lens of humble optimism. Jesus knew that his time was drawing to an end because he knew a new beginning was coming, a beginning where the Holy Spirit would come and would expand, fill our hearts. Something new is coming, and it is very exciting. The hope of the story that we talked about 2 weeks ago is continuing to grow. We are moving towards Pentecost, and the story is continuing of something that is expansive and wonderful. What will you do with this time that we have?